Hey everyone, my name is John. I'm a video game composer and one of the team members on the research project, Musical Automation in the Australian Games Industry. Now this video is my own personal recounting of our project. This is the point of view of one of the four main members of our team. And I want this video to be about the project's journey, its development amongst the kind of greater evolution of AI globally that was happening wildly along the same times. Now, this is not an unbiased reflection. If you want our actual unbiased analysis and results, go to our industry report and our other media. What this video is and what this video aims to be is kind of my own experience of the project and of the bigger picture. Now, I'm a video game composer myself, and so throughout this whole process, I had one foot in this research project as kind of an unbiased researcher in some ways, but I also had another foot in the actual video game industry, particularly the indie industry. And so everything that was happening around generative AI, I was fortunate to kind of have these two simultaneous perspectives that I could analyze it through. Otherwise, please stick around and enjoy the journey of this project. So the idea for this project started in early 2023. I probably met Dr. Sam Whiting for the first time. We were both working at the University of South Australia, and I had heard him mention his history in his own music research during one of our staff meetings. I was personally new to the uni, and I was keen to meet others in my field, so I shot him an email just to meet, and we caught up for coffee. Sam, turning out to be the knower of grants that he is, told me about the Digital Futures Initiative being offered by APRA-AMCOS and, at the time, Australia Council for the Arts, now Creative Australia. Now, it's important to kind of note that this discussion was happening in the few months into the kind of big generative AI hype and hysteria when ChatGPT had really kind of swept into the education sector along with every other sector, and the news was everywhere. In our chat, we realized that this would be a really interesting opportunity to bring both of our histories together and develop a research project which both did a pulse check on how game audio professionals were feeling about generative AI and how they may already be using it, but also to build out a toolkit which offered some of the power of being generative, but without the major concerns of how the big generative AI platforms had been developed at this stage. The project itself ended up being split into three main streams. These were the interview, research and analysis stream, in which we did 26 long interviews with game audio professionals, other game professionals, audio software developers, and game consumers. And all of this was to be analysed and then turned into the industry report, which you can now read. Our second stream was to create what ended up becoming the MetaMIDI Toolkit, which is a highly reactive music system built on Unreal Engine's MetaSounds technology. And this fed into our third stream, which is our video game called ReSounding, which is taking this MetaMIDI Toolkit and using its kind of audio technology to help create an experience to simulate what it's like to grow up with neurodivergence. We'll explain these streams more in depth once we get into it, but the very exciting news for us, we won the grant. Dr. Susanna Emery had actually joined the project while we were putting this grant together. Being a video game lecturer at UniSA, she was really well situated to be the lead designer and creator of the video game. Susie and I had already built up rapport a couple years earlier as co-hosts on the Cafe Booleans podcast. So once this project was underway, we could move straight into the discussion about the design philosophy of the game. Susie had the idea of creating a short video game experience which expressed the feeling of growing up with neurodivergence. The gameplay, the visuals, and the audio of the game would adapt to reinforce this experience. This audio would be powered by what became our MetaMIDI toolkit, and that toolkit I would personally be developing. While the design for the toolkit went through a few phases, it was always grounded in wanting to provide a dynamic music system which could be controlled through a front-end user interface which did not require musical knowledge. We were starting to see the explosive popularity of art-making Gen AIs, such as Midjourney for visuals, and then later Suno and Udio for music. One of the great positives that the pro AI believers would emphasize is its ability to democratize art making. By using these tools with a very simple user interface and not needing to know the technical knowledge to do the prompts, people with very little art or music training could make amazing pieces of art or music. However, there were many questions being raised about the data that these generative AIs were being trained on. While the legality is still being worked through at the time of making this video, much of this data came from artists who were actually never asked for consent. While we were never expecting the MetaMIDI toolkit to come close to the widespread hype of generative AI, I thought that maybe it could represent one of many alternatives, showing that you can create those same democratizing powers of a non-expert user interface, while including a depth of customizability for the experts to actually go in and get their hands dirty and customize. We decided early on that I shouldn't have too much to do with the game design itself, so then the MetaMIDI toolkit that I was working on could be hopefully a bit more general purpose and rather than specific to our game. While I ended up building most of the toolkit myself using Unreal's meta sounds and testing inside one of our test levels, I actually didn't play through the whole game until the end of the project. At the same time, back on the interviews side of the project, Sam and I were designing the specific process, going through our ethics applications, pulling together contact lists from both of our networks and other game audio and game development bodies. The project was very early, but it was ramping up quickly. Finally, we were underway with our interviews. While I had already been having similar discussions around AI with other game composers in my own industry, some of the interviews left me feeling shocked. While we were doing these interviews to analyze and transform into an industry report, these discussions and our recipients' openness were actually transformative for me as a game composer myself. Initially going in, I thought we would maybe have a couple people excited, but the majority of people scared. But in the end, we had game professionals, and even audio-specific ones, sitting along all sides of the spectrum between fear and excitement around the future of generative AI. Some thought that it was going to destroy creativity. Some thought that it was going to unblock the creative rut that music had been in for the last 20 years. Some never wanted to touch AI. And some wanted to have their own personal AI trained on their own music compositions to help as like an assistant. And alongside all of this, the global world of AI was starting to get crazy too. OpenAI, the big name in generative artificial intelligence up to this point, the golden child. It had originally been created to be the shepherd guiding the safe development of AI, especially generative AI. Then, in the span of one weekend, CEO Sam Altman had been fired by the board by not being forthcoming with information. He was then hired by Microsoft. Then the majority of OpenAI employees put down an ultimatum that if the board didn't bring Sam back in, then they would leave the company. And this forced the board's hand to ultimately bring Sam back in as CEO, even stronger now. That board was then dissolved and replaced with a new board more in line with his vision. This was historic, not only in how hyped up it was in social media, but this was the first clear and very public red flag of any company's ability to safely regulate the development of AI. You see, OpenAI had been created as a non-profit, and here it was, now the fastest growing for-profit company in history. As one analyst would later reflect, we saw the guardrails of generative AI's safe development being blown apart in that moment. It was during these months that I also started hearing about Suno, a generative AI for music. Probably the first music AI that people seem to be taking seriously. It wasn't that I heard composers talking about it and how they wanted to use it. It was more I heard non-composers talking about how they were using it to make music that they enjoyed listening to and that they would use in their own media. So many of our interviews up until this point were discussing generative AI's impact on game audio, but it was always in the future tense. What do you think is going to happen? What is the hypothetical situation when a music generative AI finally comes out and is publicly available? This is especially interesting because a number of our respondents did mention that they could speculate about the future of AI and its impact, but they really weren't worried, and they saw no point in being worried until they actually saw the thing happen. Suno was the start of suggesting that it might actually be happening. Into the new year, we were continuing and completing our run of interviews. After 24 long conversations, I had come into the new year thinking that I had actually heard most of the opinions around the matter. I was wrong. Each new conversation still brought a new spin, a new perspective, and would still bring even more nuance to the conversation. We originally started without any voice actors in our initial contact list, but now I had interviewed 4 or 5. And where I came out of one interview with a voice actor thinking that the entire community was against AI, my next interview with a voice actor would say the complete opposite. That there were voice actors who actually wanted to work with AI and were excited about it, but they felt like they couldn't be transparent about this with their own community. Later, I heard where one singer might have felt threatened by others using AI voices. Another actually felt liberated by using the same AI to transform their own voice. To them, it was an expansion of their creative potential, not a threat. And it was through these discussions, especially coming into the new year, that it was becoming more obvious that a lot of the discussions we were having weren't just about the technology of AI. These discussions were becoming about larger social issues, about economic structures, about the roles of incentives in the workplace, about the information disconnect between those in cities and those in rural areas. These were discussions about how neurodiversity came into the planning stage of the creative process and how that might be helped by AI, and in turn, then helping the creative process. As it turned out, many of the big conversations around AI are actually not specifically about AI, the technology. A lot of the big conversations are about the larger climate, the larger culture, the larger economy that it takes place in. All in all, we recorded something like 22 hours of interviews across 26 people. While we obviously can't claim that this is representative of all game audio and all game professionals in Australia, we do feel it gave us a wide enough snapshot to see the biggest recurring themes emerge, and it at least uncovered a few more themes that definitely deserve further research. It was at this stage that we could finally wrap up the interviews, and we were ready to move into analysis. But first, let's take a small side tangent. This is a tangent that is not specifically about generative AI, but it is about how music culture may be changing in amongst the larger movements of artificial intelligence. In early 2024, it was announced that the long-running, popular, and somewhat divisive review website Pitchfork was now going to be merged into the men's magazine GQ. Pitchfork had been around for almost 3 decades, and this announcement by Condé Nast, who was the owner of both Pitchfork and GQ, ended up resulting in many layoffs of the magazine. While it was technically a merging and not a closing down, many people across the internet wrote articles and posts lamenting the end of Pitchfork as the end of an era. Pitchfork had originally been purchased by Condé Nast back in 2015, as Pitchfork's advertising revenue was starting to become too unstable to rely on. That was already the direction that the internet seemed to be taking, and that same direction ended up culminating in the decision that Pitchfork wouldn't be financially viable moving into the future. While people were still speculating why this happened, one of the more likely reasons is that with the introduction of music streaming and along with it AI recommendation algorithms, people now had their own personalized recommending systems and didn't necessarily need to seek out review websites. As Pitchfork was already pretty divisive, especially in the early days, some of the very poetic language used in reviews also made it seem like these reviews were their own art form rather than something unbiased. For some people, they're probably very happy about the personalized recommendation algorithms. It's probably helped them find a lot of new music, a lot of new art, and it is personalized to them and their tastes. It's worth asking about the place of the human connection and the actual subjective bias of the human reviewer. Is that something that we actually find helpful to find new music and new art? I don't have the answers, that's beyond the scope of our research, but I do think this is a very interesting case study that reflects the same cultural values that are being challenged in the research that we've conducted about how AI, generative or not, is changing the place of the human in the creative process. But back on our project, on the video game and the audio toolkit front, we were making some really good progress. I had been discussing what we were creating with some of fellow game composers at our monthly catch-ups, and quickly realized that by having to compose algorithmically using internal knobs and sliders the way that I had originally designed the MetaMIDI toolkit, it wouldn't really work with the workflow already established by most of the composers out there. I realized that if we could design a way to import MIDI versions of music that was already composed in other software, then it would make it a lot more accessible and a lot more easy to compose for. Most digital audio workstations include the ability to export to MIDI files. The only problem was that it turned out that Unreal Engine didn't include a way to play MIDI files, and neither did MetaSounds. So we had to design our own solution. This is a good point to introduce George Martin a bit more. He was the lead programmer on the video game, and he was later brought into the interview analysis side of things because he had a lot of growing research experience as he was doing his own PhD at the same time. George and I had also previously worked together on a game called Rooftop Renegade, which was released in 2023, where he did most of the programming and I created the player reactive soundtrack. George and I spent a large amount of time building solutions for playing MIDI files through Unreal's MetaSound system and through a few kind of hack jobs here and there. And in classic roller coaster development fashion, in the span of one particularly chaotic week, we went from having designed this very complex solution that neither of us could fully understand ourselves, to then realizing that it wasn't going to work in the first place, to then the next day accidentally stumbling across a much easier solution by accidentally finding an undocumented feature of MetaSounds. And then that celebration was dashed again because that's when I found out that Epic released their own way to play MIDI files in the latest version of Unreal Engine, which was released just 1 week earlier. This was initially a minor blow to my ego. Once I got over that quickly, it was clear that this was actually a fantastic update for the engine and for the industry as a whole. And it also meant that we could leverage this new feature in Unreal Engine 5.4 inside our own MetaMIDI toolkit. After a very small learning curve, this then actually allowed us to have the MIDI playback implemented quickly, and we could switch back to focusing on the interface and the player reactive nature of the toolkit. And this also allowed us to make the toolkit a lot more accessible for composers, more so than we had originally designed too. Just like Suno a few months earlier, another impressive music generating AI called Udio was starting to make the rounds. I remember around this time, some friends started asking me for advice on musical terms they could put into the text prompt to try and get it to generate music closer to what they had in mind. Both Suno and Udio would continue to add features over the coming months, aiming to give users multiple ways to prompt the AI and then to extend the music that it generates. Despite this, I actually still wasn't personally hearing of people in the industry using these tools to generate music. That's not to say it wasn't happening, but at least in this point in time, the composers and sound designers I know still seem to want to stick to their own tools and their own workflows. One thing I had heard more excitement around was Sonic Charge's Synplant 2, which was actually released in the previous October. Synplant 2 claimed to use artificial intelligence to analyze any recorded sound you put into it and then rebuild it using its own synthesis technology. Now, the great thing was that as opposed to the black box approaches of Suno and Udio and ChatGPT and Midjourney, where you have no idea how the product gets created, Synplant was actually showing you how it's created so you could then learn yourself to create similar sounds. In my experience, Synplant 2 worked amazingly with some sounds and completely missed the mark with others. But that to me was still a really interesting step forwards when it comes to AI. Our aims with our own MetaMIDI toolkit were very similar. We wanted to create something where you could pull back the curtain and learn and extend the inside. Our front end also tried to use almost no musical terms so that any game designer could play with it and get more of an intuitive feel for how to make and change the music to their liking. And if they were interested, or if they had a composer or a technical person that was wanting to customize things further, the source was completely open for them to do so. Unfortunately, our MetaMIDI toolkit came together and we could put it online and share the code for public download. I was able to give the toolkit to Susie and George to play with, so then they could get a bit of a feel for it, and then they could use that to implement player reactive music into the live ReSounding game in a way that I had no say over, and that was by design. You can download that through the links in the description. Back on the other side of the project, the analysis of our interviews were in full swing. It was actually really fascinating for me to go through all of our interviews a second time after taking a break for a couple months. I had picked up on a number of our trends in the first run through, and now most of those trends either appeared stronger, but also I started to see other trends emerge. For example, some software which appeared kind of noteworthy in the first run through turned out to be mentioned a surprisingly high number of times. The Isotope suite of plugins were mentioned often as one example of AI-powered tools that audio professionals would use. They would also come up sometimes as one of the examples of people being confused about whether tools were actually AI-powered or whether it was just a marketing terminology gimmick. Another example was RIAA, which is a very highly customizable digital audio workstation. This was mentioned a number of times as a great example of automation. Interestingly, there were also mentions of people using ChatGPT to help with the actual coding of RIAA's own automation scripting system. And so here we had a really interesting example of not using generative AI on the output, the music, but using it to code the non-AI automation, which would then be used on the tools, which are then used to create the music output. A lot of work went into the analysis of these results between multiple people, and the most prominent trends and insights are now in our publicly available industry report. You can also find a link to that in the description. And then, being the end of the project, I was finally able to play Susie and George's game. Now, I don't want to give away too much of the game, but I went in experiencing all these different emotions. Why was the music getting louder and getting more upbeat in seemingly random places that weren't linked to my objective? After being a bit frustrated and wrestling with the game a bit, it finally dawned on me what they had done. The music wasn't there to guide me to my objective, it was there to distract me. This game was about simulating and reflecting the experience of what it is like to grow up with neurodivergence, and the music was distracting me the same way that many people with neurodivergence experience these distractions from what they're trying to do in their day-to-day life. One of the coolest things was that they had done this using the MetaMIDI toolkit that I designed, but I had no input into how it was used here. They had taken this toolkit and they had blown my mind with it. You should definitely try out the game yourself. You can find a link to that also in the description. But this is exactly what we're talking about, wanting to see people take this toolkit and take it further for the needs of their own game. And so here we were, almost a year after the project started. We were deep into analysis, deep into the world of the tumultuous discussion around generative AI. Suno and Udio were evolving in the musical space and gaining further funding. Microsoft and Google had pivoted their enormous efforts and were now actually calling themselves AI companies. OpenAI, the non-profit started to prevent the dangers of AI, was now actually the fastest growing for-profit company in history, with a CEO who had come back stronger after being fired by the board, and who had now actually just dissolved their own internal safety board. From my own personal perspective, and from a number of other people I talked to, It seemed to be becoming clearer that these venture-backed movements driving AI to develop as fast as possible couldn't actually be guided carefully by the law or by any form of risk management. It just wasn't holding. Governments and courts just couldn't keep up with the technology. I had prided myself on not being too emotionally affected by generative AI up until this point. But in short, I think by being totally immersed in this discussion for a long time and being plugged into the barrage of weekly, if not daily, controversies around all the commercial hands guiding the future of this supposedly world-changing technology, it actually finally hit me. And I finally reached a point where I found my own identity as an artist challenged. I hit a point where my own motivation for making my own personal music seemed to be drying up, and that was really scary. I'm sure I'll talk about this elsewhere because it's outside the scope of our research, but partly because I can't show you the actual interviews we gave with game composers, I wanted to at least give you a little bit of my own perspective as one. Fortunately, I did find my way through again, and I did rediscover my creative flame. But it was actually through this process that I realized something. That many of the fears around generative AI are said to be around creatives and other workers losing income, losing jobs. But what I was experiencing wasn't a loss of income. It was losing motivation to create in the first place. I figured out that rather than the technology itself, it actually turned out to be the news cycle around AI itself. It turned out to be the attitude of the companies who were guiding AI development. It turned out to be all the utopias and the dystopias being promised by OpenAI, by Microsoft, by Google, by all the other giants of the industry. It turned out to be companies promising that AI was democratizing creativity, but then those same companies saw no hesitation in training on creators' art without their consent. It turned out that the biggest threat to me personally and that my art was actually the culture and the climate of fear that had been built around AI, the narrative around it, here and now today, and not some technology in the future. And then some news caught us all by surprise. On June 24th, the Recording Industry Association of America sued both Suno and Udio, those two big music generative AI websites, for blatant copyright infringement. The RIAA includes the Universal Music Group, Sony Music Entertainment, and Warner Music Group. And they claimed that both generative AI sites were generating music which was clearly trained on their catalogs, because the music being generated, the output, was provably infringing on their copyrights. Now, neither Suno or Udio had made any deals with the RIAA or any of these other rights holders, and so the RIAA was seeking huge damages. It's also worth noting here that according to Rolling Stone magazine, one of the investors of Suno, Antonio Rodriguez, said that if we had deals with labels when this company got started, I probably wouldn't have invested in it. I think they needed to make this product without the constraints. We were very fortunate that so many game audio, other game professionals, game consumers, and audio software developers were happy to be so open and talk at length with us. And of course, we want to give a big thanks to all of them for their time and for their openness. We've tried our best to analyze and share those insights in our industry report. We also, of course, have to thank APRA MCOS and Creative Australia for believing in our project and funding it, alongside the University of South Australia, who also supported us financially. The industry report, our game, Life Resounding, the MetaMIDI Toolkit, this video and a number of other videos of interviews with our other team members are going to be made available on our website, so feel free to check those out. But I kind of want to end this off by talking about, where research can maybe go in the future, because there's still a lot to explore. For example, First Nations people around the world dearly need to be informed and consulted around generative AI, especially if any of their voices or other work is used for training the data of these generative AI models without consent. People living in rural areas can often feel and be disconnected from AI and other large discussions around technology. And yet, if this technology truly is democratic, then it does need their voices. We also started to realize that, as I touched on, some of the biggest drivers for people wanting to choose AI are actually rooted in a larger hustle culture and economy that we've seen emerge. This is definitely not the case for everyone. Some people are genuinely excited. But one thing we did hear come up is that this fear of not being able to hit deadlines or budget constraints would actually push some people who are on the fence to choose to use AI, sometimes even against what they consider to be moral. It's worth asking questions around how the more people use AI to create entire projects themselves, are they less likely to need to mix with other professionals in their own community? And how will this affect the health of our creative communities? It's worth asking about how each human creator can rely on AI and they don't have to be as hands-on in the process themselves. Will that change how the audience feels about that artwork and how they connect with that artwork? And I definitely think it's worth researching and exploring an artist's sense of identity in the world and how that might be threatened or empowered or changed or anything in this world that is emerging around AI and the world that we're moving into. These are just to name a handful, but there are many more cultural, economic, legal, governmental, technological, and other angles ripe for discussion and opportune for further research. I think it's up to each person to at least be informed on how generative AI works and how the tools are trained and the companies behind them. If we're an informed society which consciously choose to use generative AI, then at least we can feel confident that the world we are moving into is actually the one that we decided on. We hope that our research can be helpful in part of that understanding for you, just as we were very fortunate that these conversations and this research journey has helped our own understanding. Thank you.